Good evening, everybody. Welcome to our March Autism 200 presentation. Extremely excited to welcome Dr. Georgina Lynch. She's from Washington State University, and she's going to be talking about the visual pathway in autism, explicit teaching methods to promote social communication.
Okay, thank you, Jim. Well, it's a pleasure to be here tonight, and I'll give you a little bit of background about myself before we get going on the topic. I am trained as a speech-language pathologist. I've worked with kids clinically for 20 years. I've also got background in neuroscience and psychology, which is why we're merging this topic together this evening. You're going to hear a little bit about brain research, as well as a little bit about clinical intervention and how these two can come together in terms of using background in brain research to inform clinical work. So as Jim indicated, I'll be talking about the visual pathway, and basically what most people don't realize when they think about autism is they're always focused on, well, we need to build language, we need to immerse children in language in such a way that we spend most of our time talking to them and using lots of words and lots of conversation. And tonight I'm going to send a message that sounds a little bit different and a little counterintuitive from a speech pathology perspective, where I'll be saying less talking is actually more. And by the end of the presentation, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So an overview of the topic this evening, I'll be talking about the core social deficits early in development, which are foundational in understanding how the visual system affects response to interventions. And we'll talk a little bit about brain development and underconnectivity in autism and what that means in terms of presentation clinically. The visual pathway will be discussed as a mechanism for understanding aspects of physiology that affect social responsiveness. So I'll be talking about that in terms of our work with eye tracking and pupillometry and the research studies that we're practicing to better understand that. And then last, how we integrate modalities. So there are a number of strategies to support building blocks for language. And those same strategies that we use in early childhood development can actually be applied to advance social language skills. So some emphasis will be on early childhood, and the majority of the emphasis tonight will be on older kids with advanced language. When we conceptualize ASD, it's pretty well established that there are core social deficits that undermine the language deficits that we see in terms of early development. And we can think about these as deficits in social orienting. So we know that right from birth, children are prepared coming into the world ready to orient to caregivers and faces of those who are caring for them. And this happens almost immediately. In autism, we don't see that. We see a lack of response to the name, a lack of engagement to faces of familiar caregivers. That's a pretty common hallmark early in development. Joint attention is the other core social deficit area. And when we think about joint attention, we can think about this as a child's ability to gain the attention of another person or follow the lead of another person. And the most common way of doing this is with shared objects or shared reference. So if I've got a toy and I'm bringing that into the context of another person's line of sight or view, we're sharing in joint attention in that way. When we think about processing faces and emotion recognition, that's another core social deficit. This is something that can look different at different stages of development. Early on, we know that infants have face scanning patterns. When they are later diagnosed with autism, we see early in development that those face scanning patterns are atypical. And that leads then to difficulty in understanding emotion recognition, which has a cascade effect, obviously, in terms of language development. And then last, what we don't think a whole lot about is the motor imitation component to these core social deficits. In children with autism, they lack imitation. We know that as trained clinicians. However, what we don't understand is at the level of the brain function in this, what are they lacking? What is the challenge in terms of visual processing? And we know that there are challenges following body movement, hands, following the eyes, but particularly body movement. And that plays into how we perceive what's going on in a social context. So as we think about those core social deficits, you can see that in early childhood, we have a number of interventions that actually really focus pretty intensely on those core social deficits, and those are up to the left there. Pivotal response treatment, enhanced milieu teaching, ESDM, Jasper program. These really focus on engaging the caregiver with the child, looking at joint attention, social reciprocity, imitation, and there's a strong component involving the visual pathway in these interventions that yield pretty positive outcomes. When we get to later stages of development, however, we start to see a little bit more disparity in terms of the focus. So often we're dealing with functional behavior plans for young adolescents or young adults who maybe have such interfering behaviors that we're not able to communicate at all. Or we have the reverse, where we have children who are moving into adolescence or early adulthood who have challenges forming relationships and reading cues of others. And so the peers program would be probably the closest example of focusing on those core social deficits. And then there's a whole variety of social skills training programs that have any number of variety of interventions tied to it. So as you can see, there's really a disparity between how we focus on the visual pathway in early childhood versus how we focus on the visual pathway later in development. And perhaps there is a missing fundamental intensive focus on visual teaching at these later stages of development. So I'm going to walk us through a couple of models from research just briefly. This talk is not meant to be too scientific, but we're going to draw upon some of the neuroscience to understand why the emphasis on the visual pathway. The first is understanding that the underconnectivity hypothesis in terms of brain development and connections between brain regions impacts everything in terms of all aspects of language development. So it has been shown that there's disruption in development of pyramidal neurons, axons, and dendrites. This is physical maldevelopment that actually speaks to reduced projections between brain regions. When we see this in action, what this may mean is there may be overconnectivity in some regions and underconnectivity in others. So when we have the child who is using excessive echolalia, we could say, well, that child may have overconnectivity happening in the temporal lobe in terms of Wernicke's area, and that auditory processing is highly overconnected and has been reinforced to the extent to where that's the language that that child has. We are underconnected in terms of connecting motoric responses with that for meaning, or using visual symbols and cues to tie meaning to what that person is auditorily processing. When we think about underconnectivity in this way, what it allows us to do is it allows us to think about approaching treatment differently. Because now instead of mediating a behavioral response, my first question is, where is the underconnectivity happening? So we know we have this physical research that tells us this is probably happening. But then we also have the behaviors that demonstrate this. So we know that neural circuits are disrupted in the development and neuropathology related to autism. We also know that intensive behavioral interventions may actually help shape the efficiency of these neural circuits. And that is probably the most promising research on the line in terms of outcome measures that we've had in a long time. So Dawson's group has looked at EEG studies in which we actually see a change in brain function after 2 years of intensive intervention that focuses on all of those social core deficits that we talked about. Now, we always have known that early intervention has a big impact in terms of change in language level, change in IQ even, but to actually see brain function now in terms of measurements on par with typical development after interventions that are focused on these core deficits, that's a different kind of outcome. It is broadly reaching in terms of saying that we're changing the brain, but we can certainly say that we're at least having some kind of impact in terms of the activity associated with what we're doing. So the last kind of model I want you to keep in mind as we work through this is thinking about the superior temporal sulcus and the social part of the brain. And why that becomes important is that it has to do with the area of the brain that involves perceptual processing of social interactions and social information. And when we think about this, it can have an effect on subcortical processes. What I mean by that is I process information that you are delivering in terms of biological motion. As I approach you, as my body proximity opens up to yours, I may perceive that differently if I have deficits in this region of the brain. And it has been shown in autism that this area is underactive in regards to that kind of biological motion and processing that. Hands, face, eyes, body, how that is processed all relates to processing intentional inference. What that means is, as I reach out to you, and if I were to pour something or pretend to pour something, you would perceive that I have the intent to deliver something to you. That would be known on a perceptual level in first observing it, and then you would infer intent in terms of what I'm doing with my biological motion. With kids with autism, we know this area is underactive, and we also know that this is that breakdown that occurs back to those core social deficits where I talked about motor imitation. So in early childhood, we're teaching kids to imitate basic movements. That's a core of intervention. And we bring them along, and we kind of forget this stage of development later as they get older. So hold that in your minds for a while, and we'll come back to this in more detail. So putting that together as we think about it, we can think about the visual pathway as a mechanism for examining both socialization as well as arousal. We can think about this in terms of what is a physiologic response that can tell us whether that person is aroused and responding to us in a positive way, whether they're able to regulate their physical system. And the best way for us to do that in a very non-invasive manner is to use the visual pathway and use the pupillary light reflex as a metric for this. What the PLR tells us is it tells us about fight or flight responding. So, and other things, we'll go into that, but primarily fight or flight responding. So it's telling you how the autonomic nervous system is regulating, whether it's efficient, whether it is intact in terms of the ability to regulate back down after arousal. So we have sympathetic response happening in terms of arousal. We see that a lot in kids with autism. They have beautiful big eyes. The big eyes represent a surge in norepinephrine that causes that pupil to dilate. When we shine light in the eye, what happens is it takes a while for that pupil to constrict. That would be your parasympathetic nervous system controlling that. That's a sign of regulation of your autonomic nervous system. What happens is we see that in kids with autism, they have this atypical PLR over here, and you can see lots of jagged lines here, and I'm going to use the mouse so that our audience at home can kind of see it too. This is where the light stimulus would be delivered, and typically the pupil would constrict right away really quickly. And in the case of ASD, we see this slow constriction. The velocity isn't much, and then we see kind of this sporadic movement that happens in response to the pupil and the light. In typical kids, we see a beautiful dip, just a nice pupillary reflex dip. The light comes on, the pupil constricts, and this return to homeostasis or this return to baseline measure tells us they're modulating and their arousal is intact. So environmental stimuli trigger that reflex, but their parasympathetic system kicks in and they're able to come back to where it was before the light was introduced. That would be an intact PLR. We're beginning to look at this in terms of a biomarker for autism, but we're by no means close to that clinically. So I say that tonight just to help you to understand how intense the visual pathway is affected in terms of some of what you see as you're trying to induce social communication with kids with ASD. It can serve as a marker for dysregulation, but also this dysregulation affects attention to visual stimuli. And it's believed to subserve some of the restrictive, repetitive behaviors that we see in kids with autism. So, for example, if I gave you a computer screen and I put some images up on that screen and I asked you to track those images, there'd be an initial burst of norepinephrine that precedes visual search. So what might happen is we might see your pupils dilate a bit as you begin to search for these objects on the screen. What we tend to see is that kids with autism stay at that heightened visual search level, but we don't know yet whether there truly is a visual advantage. There's some debate over that. Some people believe that kids with autism can track objects visually much better, that this is a strength because they are aroused. But in fact, what we tend to find is that unless it's a repetitive act that subserves the RRBs, there's really no advantage to multiple object tracking. So this all becomes important, this basic science part of it becomes very important in terms of how we're approaching intervention, where we want joint attention, or we want attention on subtle nonverbal cues later in development. And having an understanding of that dysregulation helps you to understand where the visual attention deficits lie as well. So we can do that, and many groups have done this with eye tracking, and eye tracking research has really informed us in terms of a number of elements. It can tell us about gaze preferences, so what's grabbing my attention in terms of features of stimuli that come up on the screen. It can tell us about cognitive load. As you are inducing a higher cognitive demand, your pupil will dilate in response to that cognitive demand. So if I were to tell you answer 2 plus 2, and you'd say 4, then I might say, okay, let's do 5 plus 7. Gets a little harder. Now let's do 27 plus 42. Let's do 111 plus 222. Your pupil would incrementally increase in response to that mathematical cognitive load. We're beginning to look at some of that with children with autism to say, well, what is the cognitive demand in processing the face or processing that social scene? And we can look at the change in pupil size in regard to that. We can also look at features that are examined. What are they paying attention to? And that's where the large body of eye tracking research has been done. So what you see here is you see the eye tracking station. There's also ways to measure this in the naturalistic environment, which include mobile technology, eye tracking glasses off to the side there. And there are lots of ways to analyze the data. For tonight, we're going to talk about ways in which that young people with autism look to nonverbal cues and how much they pay attention to socially relevant versus non-socially relevant cues, or salient versus non-salient cues. So it helps us to think about a quantifiable way to measure attention. We know that those core social deficits include joint attention, social reciprocity, but we really don't have a way of measuring if we can change it. EEG is a measure of cortical brain activity. Because we have an increase in EEG doesn't necessarily mean that we have changed visual processing or attention to those cues, right? We just have stimulated the cortex in that way. So the eye tracker, in a sense, allows us to see what the individual with ASD sees. It may show where their visual attention is going. We don't know how they're perceiving that, however. So tonight what I'm going to talk about is an intervention that's designed to change visual attention. If we can change brain function on EEG, the premise would hold that perhaps we can change visual attention. And by changing visual attention to nonverbal cues, it's going to tune that person with autism into your social communication in a very different way. So it informs our science in terms of underlying neurology, but also can directly inform the clinical practice. So first, a brief review of some studies that are out there and that are quite well cited and have really established a foundation in this area. We know that attention to the eyes is present at birth, but it declines after 2 months. Now, that's an important concept to grasp because that tells us that the visual pathway is intact on par with typical development at birth. This is not something that preceded birth. It also tells us that perhaps it can be mediated and prevented in terms of further decline if intervention happens early enough. The results from some of the studies with the EEG tell us that, and I'll go into that in a few minutes. In this study, what they looked at were infants at 2 months, 4 months, 6 months, 8 months, 9 months, and 3 months increments after that, and then later diagnosis with ASD. And what they found is that the visual eye gaze preference actually declined in terms of orientation to the face. So your takeaway with this is that the deficits in social orienting is a primary concern, but we know that it was there in the beginning. What that means is that it's changing as the visual neural pathway is changing, just like the pupillary light reflex is slowing down. However, based on brain plasticity, it holds that we should be able to mediate this process. We would not be able to mediate this process with intervention if it was found that at birth it's deviant, right? That's a different thing that you're dealing with at that point, and perhaps pharmacotherapy or something like that. Looking at it from a perspective of behavioral intervention means that a focus on the visual pathway should actually induce some change. So the question becomes, can these interventions actually change brain activity? And we know from early work in neuroscience that environmental stimuli influence the development of the brain. Brain plasticity is quite prominent in terms of its response to environment. That's well known, to the point where dendritic branching develops as a result of stimulating particular neural pathways. So Dawson's group looked at this after early start Denver model intervention, as I mentioned earlier, and found that after 2 years of intervention with that format, which is heavily mediated by the visual pathway, there's a strong visual component to it paired with behavioral reinforcement, that those areas of joint attention, social reciprocity, social orientation, and imitation, all of that affected EEG activity that looked very similar to typical development in comparison to kids who didn't receive that intervention and received kind of typically delivered in the community speech language intervention and behavior intervention. So it was one of the first studies where they were able to demonstrate intensive focused intervention stimulating the visual pathway to actually change what's happening in terms of that brain function. Not just behavioral outcomes, but actual brain activity. Knowing this becomes very important for the delivery of what we know are evidence-based practices. So we can think about the visual system in response to the interventions that have been shown through empirical data to hold the most promise for outcome. And those interventions, ironically, all have a visual focus. And so these meta-analyses that were done in 2009 and then again in 2015, looking at outcomes related to interventions, all tend to arrive at the same conclusion. Many have a focus on joint attention or some form of visual attention that changes behavior. So I'll walk through a couple of those to set the stage for the next phase of what we'll talk about. Visual teaching, which is some of what I'm talking about this evening, visual teaching methods. These are the use of visual cues, symbolic cues, gesture, as well as visual supports like schedules. People know those work. For many years, we've always said, well, you need to give your child a visual schedule. I think any parent of someone with autism or provider for children with autism has heard this. Well, tonight we'll walk away understanding a little bit better about why that works. AAC, Augmentative Alternative Communication, that also is a heavily visual-based system that yields outcomes in terms of communication and adaptive skills. that doesn't necessarily mean speech-generating devices. So SGDs, or speech-generating devices, give us an auditory paired stimulus with the visual cues that we're using on the AAC. But those can be competing signals if not done with fidelity. So first and foremost, we think of AAC as low-tech AAC with visual support. It's really a visual support tool. Video modeling, which is probably, although well established, not as well understood in terms of how best to use it. Video modeling has positive outcomes for teaching imitation and adaptive skills. And we can do this with little ones using iPads and teach all the routines with play or with self-help skills and have them watch it back. And we see an increase in those skills independently. But video modeling, what we don't know is what is it that they paid attention to that made the difference? Was it the act of watching themselves? Was it the dynamic, animated motion that made that happen? Are we now tapping into that superior temporal sulcus and making that social part of the brain understand that biological movement better? Or is it the fact that I could stop it, slow it down, and demonstrate that skill back to that child in increments? And so you can see that all of these have that common element of drawing your visual attention toward a subset of a broader skill. And ABA does exactly that as well. With principles of applied behavior analysis, we're pairing stimuli, we're reducing competing signals, and we're reinforcing for efficient motor responses, verbal responses when we can, or joint attention and shared referent kinds of interactions. So I think it's easy to say, back to my opening comment, that the remark was, we're trying to build language, but we need to quit talking. It's counterintuitive. It makes a lot of sense now, I think, when you look at it from this lens. So we'll walk through, and this, bear with me just for a few minutes. We're going to walk through some anatomy just to really hit home the point as to what the challenges are that we see in autism. And we're going to talk tonight about primary process systems, those bottom-up systems. So when we're trying to teach advanced skills, we actually need to remember there are primary process systems that really drive the machine, so to speak. And those primary process systems, they're sensory systems which are fundamental, and they subserve higher order processes. So as you say something to me verbally, obviously I perceive that acoustic signal, but at some point I have to make sense of that acoustic signal. The primary process system is that sensory experience of sound, and it becomes processed in the cortex for forming meaning at that point. What we know about kids with autism is that cranial nerves in the brainstem appear to be either maladapted or dysmodulated at a neurological level. What I mean by that is norepinephrine modulates those nerves. And those nerves, as you can see, are in incredible close proximity to one another. So if this is the brainstem here and these are the cranial nerves, they're all in close proximity, and yet they have incredible amounts of impact on your ability to speak, to communicate, to eat, to do basic life functions. I'm going to focus in on 3 markers of cranial nerve dysfunction in autism that directly relate to this topic tonight. So in ASD we see, as I mentioned before, the atypical pupillary light reflex, and we could talk about that in terms of the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 6th cranial nerves. That's one component. That's a primary process system that's affecting the visual pathway. Kids with autism tend to have pretty good vision. It's not a vision acuity problem. It's processing what we see that becomes the challenge. We also have atypical auditory brainstem response, or ABRs. These are reflexive responses of cranial nerve innervation that help us to understand the integrity of that system. So much like the latencies that we saw in the pupillary light reflex, that slow response to the light, we see a similar pattern on ABR. So think about that for a moment. These slow latencies, these long responses, to primary process signals coming in. And we're demanding that children with autism attend to multiple cueing systems at the same time. We're actually compounding part of the problem in terms of the rate of cueing that we're doing and expecting a different response. The last is what we call atypical diadochokinetic rate, or DDK. And what that is if you think about a little child that's saying patty cake, patty cake, patty cake, there's an alternating movement to those sounds that happens and sequencing of those sounds. In kids with ASD, we're beginning to see that they have an atypical rate, that they may mix the order of those sounds up when they're verbal. Kids who are nonverbal, we see facial nerve and other nerves impacted in the form of motor weakness, which is why it makes it challenging to teach them verbal speech. This isn't just about, the takeaway of this slide is that this is not just about behavior. What we're talking about is this is a reciprocal relationship between primary process systems in the brainstem, mediating issues at the higher cortical level. Now, that sounds a little out there, some people will say. However, our work as speech pathologists with people who've had stroke, it doesn't look too much different, right? So what we're saying is when you look at behavior and you look at reteaching social communication, the goal shouldn't be looking at the outward behavioral component. It should be more about what part of underconnectivity in the brain is impacting this child's ability to grasp my cueing system. Is this a visual pathway deficit? Is this an auditory pathway deficit? Or is it the two together and I have to parse them out? So when we have those competing signals, what happens is we don't have modulation at the level of the brainstem to get efficient cortical activity at the other end. And that's a different way of thinking about things. And so we can see that system that regulates that norepinephrine, it has projections throughout the cortex, and it affects cognitive processes as well as modulation of behavior. Back to that over-arousal in that enlarged pupil. That's usually a sign of a heavy amount of norepinephrine. Right there we see this child is already ready for a fight or flight kind of response, and I'm sending 3 or 4 competing signals to this person at the same time. Well, I wonder why that anxiety has gone up, and I also wonder why I'm not getting any outcomes in terms of language development or speech development. So the eye tracking really can tell us a lot. It really is, there's established research in this area, but it really is an all-changing, everyday new in terms of what we see, in terms of both studies and in terms of technology. This particular study, done right by a team here at University of Washington now, really talks about how speech can disturb the face scanning ability of young ones later diagnosed with autism. So think back to the children with the decline in the visual pathway, where it was intact and at 2 months it started declining. And then we see now this study at 6 months, when showing images on a computer monitor and looking at the eye tracking scanning data, we actually see that there are instances where they are more efficient in scanning and less efficient. So if we have 3 kind of categories of stimuli, so the pictures that are being shown on the computer monitor, we have one which is static, that means nothing's happening, it's a photograph. We have one that is static, it's not moving, but there's affect. We had a little bit of movement with affect, but no speech. And then we have one that is speech added with body movement and affect. What we find is these young ones who later were diagnosed with ASD, they had less attention to inner features of the face, so the eyes, the nose, the mouth, when the auditory stimulus was added to the movement in the image. So as soon as we had a caregiver speaking and moving and saying, oh, wonderful things, just like we do to children all the time, right? This is how we get them to engage with us. This actually became less helpful for kids with later diagnosed with autism. It was as if that auditory stimulus became a competing signal. So in typical development, this is a good thing. This is how children learn speech very efficiently, is when caregivers are highly engaged, they're physically active, and they're speaking a lot to their children. What we actually find is it's too difficult for them to parse out the signal and pay attention to both at the same time. Now, some of you who are really well versed in the area of autism and know well of Temple Grandin know that she even talks about this. It's very difficult for her to listen and look at the same time. It's easier for her to look away and process auditory information than it is to do it at the same time. This study is one of the first to show that very early in development as an actual objective marker of this. We see that attention go down. So what that tells us is competing signals, both in treatment and in the natural acquisition of language, can be challenging for this population. So 20 years ago, we heard, well, they need to be with typical peers, they need to have the language modeling, they need to be in active learning environments. What do we think of when we hear of all of that? It's a little bit loud, it's a little bit dynamic, it's a little bit overwhelming. And this study here really spoke to exactly that fact, that these were competing signals that made it difficult to hone in on the cueing itself. So interventions when we're thinking about visual teaching methods, which is really what the topic is tonight, that's moving us now away from some of that science and making it real, is in terms of practical application, is our goal is to integrate these primary process systems, and we think about it as a bottom-up approach. So although our goal is to get to a higher order language level or use of language to build learning and cognition, we really need to understand that these are fundamental systems that are affected first, and not to start too high up in the hierarchy in terms of the expectation. So it's why our interventions that I talked about earlier, those evidence-based practices, why they're rooted in principles of applied behavior analysis, because there's lots of opportunity to practice that skill. That speaks to efficiency in neural circuits. We know that if we keep stimulating it, it will become more efficient. If we start pairing stimuli, those associations are made much more quickly, but the child needs a lot of opportunity to practice that skill. Lots of opportunity, plus parsing out competing signals. Okay, now that's not how we typically do therapy. So we have to think about how do we balance that so that it actually turns into language, that it becomes social communication and not these set of discrete behaviors that we've taught. And so our goal is to reduce those competing signals and pair the stimuli to promote visual attention to the objects, faces, contexts, and cues. In early childhood, it looks like this. I'm holding a doll right to my face, and I might say, "Do you want the doll?" And that's all I say, and I stop talking. And I might say it one or two more times, but I hold it there and I stop. And what that's doing is that's stopping that incoming information, but it's pairing that auditory stimulus with a visual object and forming that connection. This is why Early Start Denver model has started to show those kind of outcomes. It's very intentional in terms of how it's focusing attention. So when we think about visual teaching methods and we say, well, what are they? How do I do them? It's not really a technique. It's really an umbrella term that we use to describe methods that incorporate evidence-based practices, capitalizing on the visual pathway and using those visual supports and video modeling. And really what you're doing is you're incorporating a visually based behavioral approach together to improve both attention, but also to improve social communication. So it's a way of thinking about intervention. And your first question should always be not what do I want to teach the child? It should be what are the competing signals? And that's where we start. How can I reduce the complexity of the stimuli to help focus the visual attention and integrate language in the process? So those are different questions. Therapists usually approach it as, he's not talking, we need to teach him how to request. Okay, instead we're saying, he's not talking, what are the competing signals when I present stimuli to him that has a word, that has a picture? What is he attending to or not attending to? And then how can I increase the opportunities to improve that attention? And again, that would be considered a bottom-up approach. So we can think about this in relation to developmental needs. And I talked a little bit about early intervention. I'm going to focus more on older kids in a moment here, but you can see that the concepts are similar. What we teach in young children, we need to remember as kids get older. So when we have kids who have complex communication needs, developmentally, chronologically they're older, but their needs are more, we understand that we can use AAC, visual support, schedules, but the two most important components are multiple repetition of pairing those objects with words, even if the child is nonverbal. Because back to those competing signals, I now have to focus visual attention on AAC and have an understanding that that auditory cue goes with that visual stimulus. And so less is more is the takeaway. What you're doing is you're removing competing auditory and visual signals as you're introducing the AAC in that population. When we move into older children and adolescents who have verbal language, and some have intellectual ability well above average. These are the kids who are maybe even had pretty significant autism as young ones, acquired language, had intensive intervention, and actually have moved through the course of development responding to that intervention, doing really well. The issue is the very same core deficits that they had as little ones persist now in adolescence, but in a higher order context. So we still approach it from bottom up, even if you are verbal with an IQ of 132. Okay, what I mean by that is you may have the ability to rote memorize historical facts and talk about those and talk on a very advanced level, but your visual attention is not on par with your verbal ability. And we know that in these kids. So we really still fall to the bottom-up process, meaning we don't start way up here just because you can verbally express way up here. We have to build this. And so we do that by teaching nonverbal cues, and we use those visual supports. Mnemonics are visual symbols that we might hold up to help them remember certain social communication behaviors or to focus visual attention on something in that context. And then we use video modeling. We put less focus on in vivo dynamic interactions. What I mean by that is we are not going to pair kids up and have them all talking about their favorite movie and their favorite sports and all of that all at the same time. And why would that be? We know we want them to have friends and be in social groups, but why wouldn't we do that based on what we've just talked about? Go ahead. Yeah, it's just too competing. Too dynamic, too competing, and it's too hard to slow it down, right? And so, unfortunately, that's the makeup of the intervention for kids this age, is we put them in a group with other kids with autism, and we say, we're going to have you play games together, we're going to teach you these skills. The problem is that we can't stop it. We can't stop it in the moment, and it's too hard for them to process between communication partners. So the idea is that we use these other visual teaching methods to support slowing the incoming information down. So what is common to both young children and the older children is that we're still addressing those core social deficits. It's really an emphasis on joint attention, social orienting, processing faces, and imitation. I'll speak briefly about early intervention, and then I'm going to move it into older kids because I think we have a pretty good handle on intervention for young ones at this stage and making that connection pretty easily. I will highlight one example of this, though, in a naturalistic context. So in an intensive early intervention program with ABA methodology, kids with autism, kids without autism, active environment, 4 days a week, a few hours each day, in-home program, and parent education. What we found is we had kids who were not progressing in their language development. They were making some gains in adaptive skills and basic behavior skills, but there was no progression in language. They'd been at the same place for almost 6 to 8 months when I came on board with this group. And the first question was, well, I'm sitting in this environment, and what's the ambient noise level during these active routines? This is an active environment. So we brought out a clinical audiologist and said, can we test the signal to noise ratio and also the ambient noise level and see what exactly we're dealing with here? What we found is that at the quietest point in time during active instruction, it was 50 dB. At the max, it was 80 dB. And to give you a sense of that, it's like standing next to a lawnmower or even an airplane getting ready to take off. And the standards for those kinds of classrooms are usually 35 dB, and that's with a good signal to noise ratio, meaning that you're close to the person delivering that acoustic signal. And so what we found is here you had these kids who were making gains by following visual imitation, but they were plateauing in terms of their actual language development. So what we did is we actually got a sense of where the noise was coming from. And clearly it wasn't from the kids, they're nonverbal. It was all of the instructors talking over the kids and trying to get them to do these things and elicit this language. And lo and behold, what we did is taught the staff some visual teaching methods that less is more, and the visual stimuli are the focus. And what we ended up with is we actually were able to see a decrease in the ambient noise during active instruction to less than 40 dB. We also saw an increase in on-task and adaptive behaviors, and the biggest was a decrease in the number of adult-assisted prompts. Because what happened is the interventionists were providing so much verbal stimuli and so much verbal prompting direction, doing it over the top of one another, that we actually had too much competing signal. And we also had kids who were dependent on prompts, and it was ramping the whole environment up. So the use of visual teaching methods can have a pretty dramatic effect to at least get you to a baseline where you're able to reduce those competing signals. And what we were able to do is start to see kids develop not only on AAC, but also verbal speech, an increase in vocabulary and attention to those phonemic cues that go with teaching verbal speech once that sound level was dropped down. So visual teaching methods are very powerful in that context, in early development in that way. So the biggest piece we're the most excited in terms of looking at intervention outcomes and what we can do with this methodology is looking at social language intervention models. And we know that those rest heavily in the expressive language domain. What I mean by that is we're very good at teaching kids with autism to ask questions, make greetings, stay on topic, take turns in conversation. We consider that all expressive language. That's all asking the person with autism to generate some kind of social communication act. We're not as good at coming over to the receptive domain and asking them to wait and watch and read the situation. And so what happens is we are trying to teach top-down skills at a much more advanced level too early on. So top-down skills, meaning higher order processing, the use of inference, perspective taking, when we say to them, you know, what do you think he's thinking? Well, we don't even have someone who's visually attending. And so we really need to think about, yeah, that might be a little bit too high up in terms of tapping into their ability level. We know from the eye tracking research that kids with autism, even very high functioning kids with autism, are over here in terms of deficit areas. They're not paying attention to the salient cues. So for someone to try to form inference or think about what someone else is thinking or form a problem related to a social context, if we don't have this in place, we've made the leap too quickly. So what we're proposing is that we really take a bottom-up approach and start here and build a hierarchy of skills that gets us eventually to here. We know this is the end result that people want older children, adolescents, and young adults to get to. We want you to be able to form friendships, keep a job, go out in the community, but we can't do that if we haven't taught them to attend to the important things. being able to attend to those important things allow us to understand when to initiate, when to approach a person to have a conversation, how to interpret the communication that that person is giving us. So the emphasis really lies in what we're calling the VTM approach for teaching social communication, particularly older kids with ASD. We know that the visual supports kind of methods are evidence-based practice that can be effective up through age 22. So we can use this with older kids. And we include use of static photos, video modeling, all those things that I talked about earlier. We also use visually based reinforcements so that kids understand how they're doing. Where am I headed in terms of my progress toward this particular skill? When you think about reading nonverbal cues, it's very abstract. If you do it automatically, you don't even think about it when you do it. But when we try to teach clinicians how to work with kids and teach this skill, they're all over the board in terms of approach. So what we've come up with is a method where we're trying to teach from a hierarchy of skills that focuses on visual attention. And we're using eye tracking to determine whether there are some positive outcomes. Back to the can we change the brain, our question is can we change visual attention that directly relate to social context? So the current study that we're running uses an eye tracker to capture a range of interest, an area in those images that relate to the use of the hands, the eyes, the body, but also features in the context of the stimuli as well. Do we have a single person context? Do we have multiple person context? Our ultimate goal, however, beyond just understanding visual attention in terms of treatment outcome, come back to those core social deficits. What we want to do is we want to see whether we can teach them joint attention, reading those emotional expressions, and getting back to shared reference and understanding that triad that happens in an interaction. So what you see are images that were created, a set of visual stimuli where we took graduate students, because they're always so willing to volunteer for these things, and we had them demonstrate particular interactions that were rated in terms of reliability for particular nonverbal behaviors. And we divided those into 4 major categories, which I'll talk about later, but they have to do with following a line of regard if someone's pointing to something, or a shared referent. And in this instance, obviously, it's gesture use that we're paying attention to, and it's very clear in the third photo that we have a situation where she's pointing to her watch, eyes are up, her hands are open. She's probably asking, do you know what time it is, or something like that, right? So for us to infer that, we're at that highest order of the hierarchy, right? But we were able to use these cues to help us to understand that. And when I use those cues, I kind of hover in this area, right? I have to go back and forth between people in order to understand that. So what we were interested in understanding is the competing signals and stimuli that prevent us from being able to teach these skills, and what the visual distraction components are. And so we looked at 1 versus 2 person context, and we looked at what was the visual attention to those stimuli in terms of that range of interest. We set the range of interest as the face, the hands, and that's where you see these boxes. The tracker will actually give us a percentage of attention paid in those areas. And then we wanted to see where is the most of the time being spent in terms of visual attention prior to the intervention and then after the intervention. So for all kids, those who received it and those who didn't, who were just in typical social language groups, it was less than 10% of the range of interest was being attended to. Where you see these yellow lines, that is the longest amount of time that's taken in terms of the eye gaze. And you can see they tend to start focusing on things in the environment and not the interaction itself. This is at 0%, this is at 0.2%. We have a few kind of pixel attention there to little spots in the image that tells us, well, at some point they touched on that part of the photo. We see it even more clearly here in this interaction. We're hoping to capture some attention to his hands, her hand, she's pointing, and their eyes. And what we really see is this becomes much more interesting. And so we're paying attention to these non-salient cues in the environment as opposed to what's happening here between the two people. So we did this in terms of a pre-assessment for salient versus non-salient. And again, you can kind of see her sweater was highly intriguing with that zigzag pattern, which we're not surprised by. And then we start kind of meandering back here along the path. We can see tracking going down along the floor. And again, there's other reasons why some of this attention would be distracted from the people in the image. It's not necessarily just that they're not interested in social communication, but sometimes color and lighting and all of those things affect it as well. But you can see very clearly we have kind of a repetitive visual behavior happening here that's kind of interesting. And then we wanted to see, well, what happens after 5 hours of intensive intervention using a hierarchy for attending to these cues? And what we begin to see emerging is a triangular pattern of viewing that happens between the eyes, the hands, and the shared referent. And when we teach kids with autism at this level, we're starting bottom up, but we're actually labeling things in this way. What we started to see is this triangle started to emerge as a result of teaching what are those relevant cues that we need to be looking at and giving lots of repetition in the practice. So social communication training in this context was done in a group with an experimental intervention, and we compared it to kids who were attending social language groups that are done in the typical fashion. So we called them a treatment as usual group, a TAU group. And what happened is we started seeing that all the distractors in the image that tended to start to not grab their attention after explicit teaching using the visual teaching method. And instead was this triangulation started to emerge. A little bit messy, a little bit of distraction here, but we saw, again, this triangle emerging. And again, focusing eyes and hands. They're all holding a hand of cards there. They've got like a little deck of cards that they're playing with. No attention to any of the other salient features, or non-salient features. This is post-assessment with treatment as usual. So keep receiving your intervention. We'll come back and we'll see you after about 5 weeks, and we're going to just put you back on that eye tracker. You'll have another set of randomized stimuli, and we're just simply going to have you watch the images. What are we attending to? Lots of repetitive visual behavior, tending to non-salient stimuli. She's waving goodbye to somebody. This is 0% for that range of interest, 0% for eyes. Started to look at the body, but you can see this is a very non-functional visual attention pattern to visual cues. Here he's holding his hand to hold her back and keep her out of the street. Once it touched on the hand, the rest is all spent on the pattern in the sidewalk. And so the data are somewhat compelling because we start to see here is tau, no treatment, and here's BTM, triangle begins to emerge. She's holding her hand out, come sit down, she's looking at her, and she's waving hello. So the question becomes, have we ignored a fundamental process in our attempt to teach social communication later in development that we focused on heavily in early intervention and kind of forgot about as kids get older? And can we actually change it? And it turns out that the use of some of those visual supports really does make a difference. And so you have some examples here in terms of the materials that are used, and they're pretty common. People have seen visual schedules. That's nothing fancy. The fancy part is the idea that we would use it in a particular hierarchy. So these are the mnemonics that demonstrate what you should be attending to in terms of those competing signals. This is body proximity. It shows a circle around two people standing somewhat close together but open-armed, right? So it's a visual symbol to remind you, where should I be standing and where should I be looking? And then what we did is we used visual reinforcement each time they navigated some difficult part of this social skills terrain. So it became fun, but it was also incredibly explicit. And that's really what the goal of this is about. So about a year's worth of work went into this in developing a hierarchy of skills that said, how can we take you from bottom up and get you to top down? And for parents of kids with autism, maybe you have a young child now, and you know I'm working on joint attention. I'm trying to get them to look at what I'm looking at, and I'm really trying to emphasize this to teach them language. That is going to be as important later. And it's important at this stage in development that we understand that this same hierarchy can apply even with little ones. The idea is that we have to slow the incoming information down and that we have to build it in terms of incremental stages. So back to my comment about social language groups and when we put everybody together and everyone's talking all at once, we're not able to stop those competing signals, where here we're talking about we're going to build from facial expression to body proximity, line of regard, shared referent, and inference. We go back to those core social deficits. This is social orienting. This is joint attention. Shared referent is also joint attention. And then inference is reading emotion and facial expression, right? So we're able to, through all of this, touch on those core areas, and we use motor imitation to do it. That's where the video modeling component comes in. So once these have been demonstrated at the recognition level, and we move forward to demonstrating it, playback and debrief, demonstrate, identify features and objects in the stimuli, you're beginning to build to a point where now I've matched these, I recognize them first, and now I can actually demonstrate them. And so it's a complex hierarchy, but when done incrementally, it yields those changes in visual attention that we were talking about. And that's pretty compelling because it's powerful. It gives that person with autism now something to fall back on in terms of making it an intellectual act, not an intuitive act. And we know that kids with autism are very good at what we call metacognitive skills. They can think about their thinking once you've taught it in a very explicit manner. So this is an example of the stimuli. We all hear about people teaching kids with autism emotions. They need to learn to recognize emotions. And we'll see cartoons of this. Cartoons should probably go away. Those aren't helpful to kids with autism because they're not real enough. We need to keep it pretty concrete in terms of what are they seeing. So what we do is we take static photos, we give them markers, and we actually say, what is this person feeling? And they'll say it. They know, oh, well, she's mad. What they can't do is tell you why or how they know that. And they can only label the basic emotions. The extremes. Happy, mad. My world functions in two domains, people who are happy and people who are mad. And that's essentially how they navigate the world. And so what we're asking them to do is identify features on that face that tell you that. So we know that people with autism tend to prefer objects over faces. So what we do is we break the face down and make it almost like an object to them. So just as you would label parts of an object, we're asking them to label parts of the face that then inform you at a higher level in terms of emotion recognition. Then we'll ask them to do things like draw arrows from the eyes to tell me how you know what they're looking at together. And this is the beginning stages of forming that triangular visual attention component, and put those images together. The mnemonics and the cues. And then back to our very helpful graduate students, we teach by example versus non-example, breaking it down very clearly what would be appropriate versus inappropriate. We know that this is inappropriate because that body proximity does not match this, right? And so it's a very explicit way of using visual supports that are evidence-based to then teach in real life what could be expected. From static photos, then, we move into video modeling, where we have them demonstrate it with each other, watch themselves, and break it down, and then explain how they know. So for people with autism to be thinking at this level, we make it concrete and we make it tangible. So the way that we do these activities is we might say something like, we have a game called Bell Blast, where we might quickly run through 20 of those images and have them say appropriate, inappropriate, and just ring the bell and let us know. And this comes back to that multiple opportunities to practice the skill. If it's incidental teaching, it may only come up once or twice in the context of a dynamic social group. When it is broken down explicitly as explicit visual teaching methods, we now have a way for them to make it more concrete and to ensure that they've had that opportunity to recognize it multiple times. Another one might be that we take a cup and send chips around. You've got a pile of chips, 6 to 10 chips, and we're going to ask whether you can label that emotion or whether you can identify the shared referent, and we actually use that terminology. And the goal is for them to accumulate as many as they can. It's pretty obvious in terms of that kind of reinforcement. But as you can see, when you're using these tools, they're visually based. It's not something in conversation. It's not dynamic. We're slowing the input down. And by slowing that input down, that is really what gives us this triangulation kind of effect happening. And then that allows us to use higher inferential skills with kids with autism. Starting too far, you're going to be pretty unsuccessful and then wonder why, wow, they're still not reading the cues, or wow, they've got such advanced language, but they're just not reading the situation. And so our goal is to continue this study and look at whether we can implement that change in a repeated measures design with multiple groups and replicate that. So your takeaway is that those core social deficits, they're fundamentally impacted by deficiency in the visual pathway, and this happens across all levels of severity. The highest level to the most fundamental communicative need, and that eye tracking holds promise for better understanding those nuances because they are subtle. They are not very clear, let alone clear in the naturalistic environment. And so eye tracking helps us to understand that better. And by incorporating focused visual attention, reducing the complexity of that stimuli, we're showing a greater impact due to challenges with those competing signals. And by analyzing even the stimuli that you're using can be a first step toward implementing this type of approach. Using behavioral reinforcement definitely can result in significant shifts in the visual search for relevant cues. Now, we don't know how this looks in kids who are much more impacted. We know that with, for example, the Early Start Denver model, as I've referenced a few times, change in brain activity, but we really don't know yet whether the visual search changes and if that's what's causing that to occur. So more needs to be done with that younger population in that way. So less is more. It doesn't mean you'll never come back to complex language again. It doesn't mean that we don't continue to talk and engage and keep that language stimulation going. We still do that. But what we have to do is slow it down a little bit and balance out both the expressive and the receptive language domains for social communication to be successful. And parents are naturals at this. I see all the time, especially in the hurriedness of the day, a parent is going to use nonverbal cues, sometimes a lot more than they will use verbal cues. And so if we can get kids very early in focusing in this way and get the parent emphasizing it, it makes a big difference. So speaking with those intentional messages really helps slow down that incoming dynamic social information. And pairing those objects and cues together help reduce competing signals. This kind of instruction is needed at all levels. We should not drop treatment for kids when they're 10 or 11 years old just because they've acquired language and have been successful. That's literally pulling the rug out from under them because these needs continue later in development. And that's probably the biggest takeaway. So some resources on evidence-based practices. There's some nice tutorial modules that are available too in helping you see some of these in action in terms of visual supports. And contact information and our lab information is there for you as well. So I'll open it up for questions. Thank you.
And for everybody here in the room, if you are going to ask a question, if I can just give give you the microphone so that the folks that who are watching from home will be able to hear. Does anyone have any questions in the room? I'm always ready to start with questions. You want
Love
to
it.
start? Okay, you can start. I'll wait till later.
For a 13-year-old who's very verbal but probably lacking in the visual pathway, like you mentioned, is reading a good tool to help him focus? And, like, I don't know, what do you think of reading for that? Is that something they can't attend to, or?
I think if you have a child who has reading ability on par with even developmental and age level, then that's certainly a modality to tap into. Although there's a language load to it, it's still a visual referent. You do have to kind of consider the complexity of how much you're asking them to incorporate that as a cueing system. I think the importance around this is the actual cueing of it. So you can incorporate reading, but it's probably not the same as the visual attention component. If you use reading, I would say use it just like you would with oral speech, with limited context. Yeah. But for sure, definitely written cues are helpful. Yeah.
You've talked a lot about kids with ASD not visually attending to the correct things. A lot of kids with ASD also end up getting diagnosed with ADHD.
Yes.
Can you talk about that?
Yeah, excellent question. Thank you for that question. So that is a big piece of it, and what we find is that children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, they tend to persist in inattention. Kids with autism, when you bring visual cues in, will stay with it, even in the context of attention issues. It's an intriguing presentation of symptoms. It's almost what sets apart a classic ADHD from ASD with comorbid ADHD. And what I mean by that is we know that with kids with autism, they tend to be distracted in general. Sounds in the environment are stimulating. We have sensory overload often that compounds itself on ADHD with autism. Kids with ADHD, you bring in visual supports and they don't care. It's not that they don't care, but they don't respond to it. Kids with autism, even with ADHD behaviors, tend to hone in on the visual supports, because what it does is it now gives them an anchor to make sense of their environment. And that tends to be what we see clinically anyway. And no one's done a study on this, but I can tell you that the use of visual supports are evidence-based for autism, even with comorbid ADHD, but not necessarily making any difference in kids with ADHD. So, excellent question. Thank you for asking that.
So I was wondering, the data you presented in the intervention, what age range of kids were you typically targeting that you were seeing these outcomes, where you're getting the triangulation? Were these younger kids,
Right.
school-age children? Can you speak more to that?
So this was older school age and early adolescence. So we had age 9 through 14.
And are you guys hoping to scale it down,
Yes.
or what are the thoughts? Future
Yes.
plans?
So this was a beta testing kind of procedure for feasibility. And these were kids that we actually had a pretty extensive clinical process for subtyping the sample. And we were looking at kids who would be diagnosed really level 1 autism. So there were some rule outs that we had to do in terms of, your ability to participate in turn taking, sit in a chair, follow basic directions. There were some basic fundamental screening procedures that were done there. And we also knew that most of the referrals for social communication and social pragmatics tended to come after kids had already received that intensive early intervention. So the question really that holds is, for what age does this have the most effect? Are there sex differences in this? Because we know that girls present with autism very differently and are often identified later. And how is their visual attention different? We know that we probably, with an intervention like this, would not want to go much lower than about age 8, 7 or 8. And the reason being, because we would probably be using those other early intervention models in terms of eliciting the language development. So there's a window of time And this is really where it does kind of separate those kids who fall on the spectrum more impacted and stay impacted versus those that separate out and become more higher functioning. It's about age 7 we know that. We typically see that. And what I mean by that is once kids have verbal language and they're able to articulate and think about what they're thinking and talk about what they're thinking, we now have an ability to tap in using this particular hierarchy. That's a little bit different than just focusing on those core deficits earlier on without a language modality. So this group, 9 to 14, I think the oldest, we only had one who we were recruiting for up to age 14, but we had one who was 13. And so it's really a pretty tight window already, but that's the question, is what's magic about it? What if we started it at 6 or at 7, right? We probably could.
All right, I'm going to ask my question then. So, lots of families will report that their services, especially speech language therapy in the schools, are kind of discontinued. Happens a lot in later elementary school, can happen in middle school, especially in these kids who are quite verbal. So any recommendations to families, parents out there, in regards to how they communicate to the school and advocate for some of the type of goals and that you're talking about tonight?
Right. I would say that absolutely that's one of the drawbacks that we have right now, and where we're kind of dropping the ball on kids in terms of dismissal of services after a point of plateau or acquisition of language skills that appear to be functional or where they're at for their chronological age. So first and foremost, I think it's important to go back to the school and say that we need these services. I can tell you clinicians are hungry to get it. This is one of those things where the clinician can be your advocate as well. Our goal with this intervention is that we can also reach out to clinicians and train them on how to do this, because it isn't intuitive, and this is the result of a lot of years of work clinically, as well as developing a research design that can map the intervention onto something that shows an outcome. So clinicians are hungry for this. The second component that I would talk about in relation to that is emerging evidence that shows that later in adolescence and early adulthood, cerebral volume decreases in people with autism, and this is in line with a dip in adaptive skills. Now, what I mean by that is we have studies that are showing that the brain itself changes in not a good way as people with autism enter early adulthood. And at the same time, it's observed that adaptive self-help skills decrease. Now, we don't know whether this is an organic neurological process of neurodegeneration, or is it the result of removal of intensive intervention? Is there still learning to occur that isn't occurring? And as a result of that removal of that intervention, which often happens about age 13, 14, when actually, with hormonal development and everything else, we have changes that actually warrant more intervention even more intensively.
Right. Thank you very much. And I think that when we're thinking about, lots of parents will report like these kind of like cliffs that they fall after elementary school. You fall off a cliff from getting services, and then heading into high school, it's another cliff. And then of course, once you're out of 18 or 21, there's very few services out there, and there's evidence that adults with autism continue to learn, and sometimes all the way until their 20s and their 30s, they're still learning social information. They're still learning skills that that typically developing people they end up having, and then they kind of plateau.
Right.
So that's really very important information for us to continue to provide support right through adulthood.
I agree. Yeah, 100%.
So this question is from Nikki on Facebook. She is wondering, what modules can parents use to help with VTM at home?
Ooh, that is a fabulous question. So what I would say is probably most helpful for parents at home right now, because a lot of this particular intervention is not available commercially, it's just a way of thinking and what we've done with it, is tapping into the National Professional Development Center and the training modules that are available on that site. And that would be this first link here. And what it does is it actually will walk through video demonstration and break down what the goals of those interventions are. And I believe there's 2 or 3 that are based on visual supports that are in that module. And in the interim, our team is working on developing some of these interventions to actually make them both available in tutorial for clinicians as well as for families. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm. Thank
So we
you.
have one more question from Facebook. This one is from Polly. Polly says, my child is 7, so the best way to help my child would be what? Visual cues?
Okay, very open-ended question.
open-ended
Yes,
question.
but we can certainly start grappling
Yep.
with it. I would say that there's probably never a time that you wouldn't use visual cues. We could start with that. I think the research is pretty compelling, and that's the beauty of the work being done by these incredible teams that are looking at visual attention and brain activity, is it's not detrimental by any means. It supplements. And it comes back to the philosophy that if I were to implement AAC, my child won't talk then. You know, some people think that. It's not true, of course. It's the same thing. If I implement visual teaching methods or visual strategies, will my child become so dependent on them that they need them all the time? No, not necessarily. It's no different. The analogy I use is if someone took your printer icon away from your computer screen, you might be helpless at first, but you would know to go to File, Print, etc. You wouldn't want to. It makes your day much easier by knowing exactly where that icon is. Visual teaching methods and visual supports are used in much that same way, and so very valuable at age 7 still.
So one more follow-up question from Nikki. So this was about the VTM at home, and so you referenced the evidence-based practices and tutorial modules. She's actually looking at them right now and specifically wondering which one she would select.
Yeah.
If you can guide it off.
Yeah, as I recall, there's one that is visual schedules and there's one that's visual supports.
Perfect.
And those would be what you'd want to look for. Yeah, and then there's others on ABA and other things, but the most relevant for tonight would be those.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
She says she very much appreciates it.
Thank you for your question, too.
Wondering if you could talk a little bit more about video modeling.
Sure.
And where you know kind of providers or clinicians or even parents might be able to access some of that.
Sure. Video modeling in terms of speech pathologists' understanding of it is pretty commonplace. It's typically done with an iPad. So the first question always is, are we using an iPad or are we not using an iPad? When the therapist is in control of the scenario, it becomes very productive in terms of slowing that teaching process down. It's important with video modeling that you understand the steps. There are steps to it. You keep it brief. You keep the steps of what the skills are that you're trying to teach brief, so no more than 3 or 4 steps, for example. And you'll record the child doing it, you'll play it back, and you'll have the child watch it. So it's very useful, as I mentioned, for things like imitation, teaching basic play skills, teaching routines, and adaptive skills. In terms of abstract language, like we talked about tonight, reading social scenarios, walking up to 2 people and judging whether they're ready to talk to you, that requires some pretty intensive intervention. Probably wouldn't be best done at home, I don't think. But in clinics, what most therapists are doing is they're using the iPad as a way to just give that feedback immediately to that child. And that could be done at home in a pretty easy manner also. Video modeling is also part of those tutorials.
Okay, so we have a follow-up clarification from Polly. So the second question, she says she does know that visual cues help, but she's specifically asking for how does she get this to help through ABA?
Oh, okay. Oh, that's a fabulous question. So, I spent some time today observing at the Seattle Children's Autism Center and really enjoyed watching some of this in action. And what those clinicians were doing so nicely is they were balancing out receptive expressive language. So, using visual cues, they were getting kids to both initiate as well as recognize. And so, what happens is sometimes when we're using ABA, we fall too heavily in the receptive domain. Show me, point to. There was none of that happening today. It was beautiful instruction that was a lot of pause, wait, tap a visual symbol, child points. So we've demonstrated joint attention, line of regard, and then child either verbalized or tapped again and showed a gesture to get what they want. That's how best to use visual teaching methods in ABA practice. And really skilled BCBAs and behavior technicians know how to do this nicely. You should see that kind of dynamic interaction back to the core deficits. We're addressing joint attention, line of regard, shared referent, and motor imitation as well. So, yeah, thank you.
Any more questions here in Seattle? More questions online? Nothing? Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Lynch,
Okay.
for coming in. It was really great.
Thank you. And thank you for the excellent questions.